All right, so we're going to be in Mark 7 this morning. So if you got your Bibles, go ahead and head there. In the Pew Bibles, it's page 712. Mark 7. As we get into this morning, we're going to look at, we'll probably kick back to Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, that sort of thing. And so if you've ever had any questions about what is the deal with all of these food laws and the sacrificial systems and what in the world is going on, and how come I can't eat crab but cow is okay? Like what's going on? Hopefully we'll get into that this morning and try and give you some answers. I can't get into it in super depth. Thursday evening would be the time to come and bring more questions where we'll have more time, we'll be able to dig deeper. But this morning, we should answer a few of those questions, at least give you a starting point, and clear up some of the mystery and the confusion. Because what Jesus is going to do today is, oh my gosh, it blows up your brain. So with that, Mark 7. Mark 7, verse 1. It says, "The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus." So again, Pharisees, teachers of the law coming. Anytime they enter the scene, you sort of, at this point, you're kind of expecting, all right, they're going to gripe about something, right? There's a confrontation coming. So the Pharisees, they teach the law, they come all the way from Jerusalem. They gather around Jesus, verse 2, "And they saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were unclean," that is, unwashed. And so now Mark is going to explain this with the parentheses there. Verse 3, "The Pharisees and all the Jews, they don't eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders." Jesus is going to rail against that here in a minute. "When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, kettles." So what's going on here? The Pharisees have this tradition handed down to them that you wash your hands before a meal. We have to think like ancient people, not moderns. This has nothing to do with bacteria or viruses or cleansing your hands. That's an inadvertent benefit, but that's not the point at all. This is about ritual purity. So you'll notice specifically in, it's verse 4. "When they come back from the marketplace, specifically they wash their hands." So if it was just a light meal, you might douse your hands and then eat your food. If you come from the marketplace, you might go all the way and douse up to your elbows and wash your whole hands. Why? Because the marketplace is the area where you are most likely to bump into something unclean, right? At the namely a Gentile. Right? Right? And so you go to the marketplace and you bump into a Gentile, or you touch some food that you thought was clean, but somebody else made it unclean, or something like that. And so you want to be right before God, and so they would wash their hands before each meal. This is nowhere found in the Bible. This is an added tradition that rabbis have just added over time. And again, it has nothing to do with germs. This is all about ritual purity. Jesus is not a big fan. Verse 5, "So the Pharisees and the teacher of the law, they asked Jesus, 'Why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders, instead of eating their food with unclean hands?' And so Jesus replied, 'Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it's written, these people, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. And their teachings, they're but rules taught by men.'" In verse 8, "You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men." And now he's going to give an example. "So he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses his father and mother must be put to death.' But you say, well, if a man says to his father or mother, whatever help I might otherwise have received, is Corban, that is a gift devoted to God, then you no longer let him do anything for his father or mother. Thus, you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you've handed down. And you do many things like this. So what's going on here? Jesus, he's giving an example of saying, listen, you guys, this washing of the hands thing, this Corban thing you got going on, you're forgetting about God for the sake of your traditions. And so he gives this example. Honor mom and dad. One of the 10 commandments, right? Pretty straightforward. On the surface, that means listen to mom and dad, right? They're smarter than you. Listen to them. That's certainly in there. But more so in the ancient world, like a major thrust of this is when mom and dad get old and feeble and they can't work the farm anymore, take care of them, right? When mom and dad get old, honor them. Take care of mom and dad. So you adult children, honor your mother and father. Take care of mom and dad when they get too old to take care of themselves. That's a major thrust of honor your mother and father. But there's this thing called Corban, which was, again, another tradition which basically said, if I have some excess over here, I'm going to say that's Corban, or that means it's devoted to God, so I can use it for my own needs, but other than that, I can't touch it. And so you have these kids, these adult children, who are skirting God's law by using Corban. And so mom and dad need help, right? And they're like, wow, man, sorry, Mom, I'd like to, but, it's devoted to God. I can't use it for that, right? And so they're hiding behind this religious tradition and invalidating the law of God. You see what's going on? You see how wicked that is? All right, and so this is just an example that Jesus throws out, and then he's gonna get to the main thrust here in 14. All right, and so again, Jesus, he called the crowd to him, and he said, listen to me, everyone, understand this. Hear this. 15, nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. That's huge. He's going to explain it further. Mark is going to enlighten us further. 17, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. Are you so dull? He asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from outside can make him unclean? It doesn't go into his heart. It just goes into his stomach and then out of his body. And look at this comment Mark throws in there. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. Do you have any idea how heavy that, oh my gosh, that would be like Jesus just throwing out the Bill of Rights. That's insane, right? As central as the Bill of Rights is to our American identity, that's how central the Bill of Rights, or the food laws are to Israel's identity, and Jesus just threw it out the window. Man, that is gutsy right there. And so 20, he went on, well, what comes out of a man is what makes him unclean. It's what comes out. For from within, out of men's hearts come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils, they come from inside, and they make a man unclean. Whoa. So let me try and back up and allow you to feel the weight of this. So what's the deal with these food laws, right? How do these factor in? We live in the 21st century, so we just think the way that we're born, right? We tend to think along scientific terms. And so when we encounter Exodus, like the latter half of Exodus, or we get into Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, and we see these strange laws about if it's got a split hoof, it's okay, but if it's not a split hoof, then don't eat it. And if it chews its own cud, then you're good, but if not, then don't eat it. And if it's a water creature and it's got fins, you're fine, but if it doesn't have fins, then avoid it, right? And it's like, what? What is the point of this, right? And so we think, all right, well, they didn't know what's going on either, but God did, and so we think, okay, there must be some sort of health reason behind this, right? It's the only reasonable conclusion we can think of. There must be some sort of health reason. These foods are healthier, they're less prone to disease, or something like that, and that's why God did this, okay? That is an absolutely reasonable conclusion based on the information we have. However, I contend it is totally inaccurate, okay? When we look at the ancient world, we start to see things in a bit more clarity, okay? Clean and unclean have no, well, at least when pertaining to food, they're not moral in any sense, right? It's not a sin to eat crab, right? And so you also have these things in there like bodily emissions, and so a woman would become unclean after childbirth. Clearly, it is not wrong to have children, right? So something else must be going on with this clean, unclean thing, right? Some sin, like immorality, certainly makes you unclean, but you can become unclean through non-sin issues, all right? And so when we look at these food laws, the fundamental, well, let me give you a bit of an idea, clean, unclean. When it came to these food laws, clean referred to foods that were natural, not in like a paleo versus processed food kind of thing. Clean referred to foods, clean was a state of naturalness, unclean was a state of unnatural, okay? And so Israel believed that God created the world, right? He created it good, in order, but sin entered and threw everything into chaos, right? And so take, for example, like crabs, all right? Crabs are unnatural in the ancient world, right? If you're in the water, you should look like a fish, right? You should swim around, you should have fins. That's what's natural. Crabs are weird, though. They're in the water, but they stay on the ground, and then they can come out of the water, and then they can go back into the water, and they got like all these legs. It's like, what's going on with that, right? And so through the ancient mind, crabs represent chaos. They represent that which is unnatural. They're not evil or unhealthy or anything. They're just a representation of the chaos, right? And so if God is at the center of Israel, then he's keeping the chaos sort of at bay, right? And apparently split hoof was viewed as more natural than not split hoof, and chewing cud was viewed as more natural than not chewing cud, right? Just based on the ancient worldviews, okay? Does that sort of make sense? I see a lot of like, what? I don't get it. Yeah, so clean referred to that which is natural, okay? And so take, for example, bleeding, right? Bleeding, when a woman, the period for a woman or giving childbirth or any bodily emission from men or women, it was considered unclean. Why? Because fluids are supposed to stay in your body, right? Blood is meant to stay in your body. When blood flows out of your body, that's a representation of sin and chaos, right? That reminds you that, oh, wait a minute, something's off, right? Something's broken, right? Blood is supposed to stay in your leg. It's not supposed to come out in a wound, right? And so all of these laws focused around this idea of God made the world, the earth is broken, right? But God is holy, and so he's keeping the chaos at bay, and to get near to God, you have to be holy. You have to be set apart, all right? Take a sacrifice, right? We look at these sacrifices and we think, what's going on with these sacrifices? I don't get it. Some sacrifices you can use a liver, nowhere in Israel are you allowed to use a liver in a sacrifice. You burn it up or you discard it or something, I forget, but you don't use it. Why? What's wrong with liver? Nothing. There's nothing wrong with liver. In another sacrifice, you can't use honey. Don't put honey on this one. What's wrong with honey? There's nothing wrong with honey. Honey is just fine. But Israel's neighbors, they used liver for something that was evil. Israel's neighbors, they would take the liver and they would cut it up and they would use it for divination practices. All right, so they would use the liver, they would slice it up and dice it in some way, and then kind of like reading the tea leaves, they would read the liver lobes. That sounds weird saying it. Right? That, again, that's just ancient people. Totally different world that they lived in than we did, all right? And so why is God saying, Israel, you don't use the liver, right? Why is God saying, Israel, they eat pigs, but you don't? He's setting Israel apart. The whole purpose of the food laws is to make Israel a distinct people, right? It's all driving at, the entire law is, well, let me say that, the food laws, they are not moral or immoral. There's nothing right or wrong about them. The entire purpose of the food laws is to make Israel a distinct people, to set them apart, okay? To make them, to sort of wall them off from the rest of the world, all right? Now, think about if you have a wicked heart, what that's going to result in, right? It resulted in what we see. You have these Pharisees who are thinking, we are awesome, and shun the Gentiles, right? I just had what is the unicorn with, anyways. There's that silly cartoon, Charlie, never mind, it doesn't matter. So it resulted in, all right, let me try and gather this back so you're tracking here. When God lays out the law, all right, so he gives his law, he gives his instruction to Israel. There's all of these weird things that we see in there that don't make any sense to us, but they made total sense to the ancient people, right? And the purpose of particularly the food laws is to set Israel apart as a distinct people, right? So the world is broken, and God selects some no-name, just some nomad, Abraham or Abram, right? And he comes to him specifically because he's a nobody, right? He has no stat. He's just not. He's a nomad, and he's the smallest building block that God could use, right? And so he picks him because he's the least likely to be picked, sort of thing. And he decides he's going to build a nation out of that. But the whole purpose of setting Israel apart was so that they would shine the light to the rest of the world, right? So God comes to this people, and he uses the food laws and Sabbath and circumcision as these identity markers, right? And so this people, you will be my people, right? I'm going to set you apart, and the whole world will know it because circumcision, Sabbath, and these food laws, right? Along with the sacrificial practices, but everybody else sacrificed, so those weren't as distinct. Why? Because Israel was supposed to do life right. They were supposed to love one another well, right? Paul and Jesus both say over and over again, the entire purpose of the law, it is all driving at one point, love one another. It's Galatians 5. The whole law is summed up in one thing, love one another, right? Love God, love your neighbor, done. That is the entire law. That is what God is trying to do. He's trying to he calls Israel, he blesses them beyond measure, right? He rescues them out of Egypt, and then he forms them into a distinct people. And the whole idea is that if they would be faithful, if they would love God and love one another, then God would bless them beyond measure, and the whole world would look at them and think, that's the one true God. Their God is the one I want to follow. And so in doing so, right, Israel would be a light to the nations, and God would draw all men to himself. That's the whole point. These food laws, they set Israel apart, and Israel is supposed to love one another better, right? They're supposed to love God and love their neighbor, and in doing so, they would be a light to the world that God would use to draw all the nations to himself. If you've read the Old Testament, you know that doesn't work out so well, right? They can't get the job done. Okay, are we sort of following so far? It's kind of a lot to swallow. Bringing it back to Mark then. bring it back to Mark. So in Mark 7, Jesus he's chewing them out big time, right? Because they've placed the traditions of men above the laws of God, right? He's saying, you missed it. Like, you missed the whole point. I set you apart as a nation separate, right? I blessed you beyond measure, and the whole point was that you were supposed to love each other and be a light to the world, and instead, your wicked hearts have perverted my law, right? And you're terrified of you're supposed to be a light to the Gentiles, and instead, you're terrified, right? And you shun them. Are you picking up on that a little bit? Right? And so when Jesus comes in and he says, it's not what comes outside that makes a man unclean, it's what comes from inside. That's a radical principle. I mean, it's all over the Old Testament, and the prophets, they just rail on it over and over again. You see in Isaiah, God constantly saying, I don't want your bulls, I don't want your goats. Right? I don't want these external religious practices. Those exist to teach you something. It's supposed to dawn on you when you slit an animal's throat and blood comes out. That's gross. That's disgusting. That's what your sin looks like to me. That's the point of a sacrifice. It's not that the blood of a bull or a goat has any power to absolve sin. No, God is communicating to them. And over, the wicked human heart, they just miss it, and they pervert God's laws, and they think it's going to be these external religious practices, that's what will get me in good with God. Right? And then they use that to elevate themselves above the Gentiles, and Jesus is just not having that. So he flips it upside down, and he says, no, it is not what's on the outside that makes you clean or unclean before God. I don't care about your food laws. I don't care about your sacrifices. I'm sick of them. It's what's inside. That is what makes men unclean. And then he's going to prove it. Look at the rest of the chapter. The next bit, 24. It says, Jesus, he left that place and he went into the vicinity of Tyre. Tyre is Gentile turf. And then he entered a house he didn't want anyone to know. And so, he entered a house, this is 24, didn't want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, right, the whole point, Israel's supposed to be a light to the world. Jesus can't help but be a light to the world. He's trying to cover it up, and he can't do it. Yet he could not keep his presence a secret. 25, in fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman, strike one, she's also Gentile, strike two, and then look at this. A woman, Gentile woman, whose little daughter was possessed by an evil spirit, strike three, she's out, fell at his feet. And then Mark is going to emphasize, the woman, she was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. And now Jesus, he's going to get into a little sparring match, right? So, no, it is scandalous that Jesus would even talk to her. I mean, that is scandalous, right? How Jesus would become unclean by talking to this woman. If he was following the traditions of the elders, no, he's out, he's unclean, right? I mean, absolute scandal. But Jesus is saying, no, it's not what's on the outside. It's the heart. That's what I'm after. And so Mark takes this example of the most unclean example he can find. She's a woman, she's a Gentile, and her daughter is demon-possessed, right? And especially in the ancient world, where it was, if something happened to your kids or you were born blind or something, then it was, well, obviously the gods are punishing you, right? Right? And Jesus doesn't like that much either, right? And so he goes to this woman, 27. He says, she begged him, please, drive the demon out of my daughter. And so Jesus, he must have sensed that this woman's got some intelligence or sensed he could kind of push a conversation here. Because what he says could be quite offensive. 27, he says, first let the children eat all they want. He told her, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Right? The children being Jews, the dogs being the Gentiles. Now look at the humility of this woman. All right, she says, well, yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table, they get to eat the children's bread. And so in this little sparring match, she sort of comes out on top, and so Jesus told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. And so she went home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon had gone. Right? And so Jesus, he puts it right into action, right? Where he says, it is not the outside that makes you clean or unclean. It's the heart. That's what I'm after. And so Mark picks this example of the most extreme unclean that he can think of, right? And Jesus doesn't care, right? He walks up to this nobody, this, like, where clean and unclean wasn't necessarily supposed to have a moral connotation. Clearly the Pharisees had turned it into that, right? Clearly they're saying, no, she's a Gentile, she's got a demon-possessed daughter, she's a woman, she's evil, she's wicked, she should be under the wrath of God. And Jesus, God in the flesh, walks up and, right, he saves the day. And it's pretty powerful. That's a pretty powerful turn, right? And so what's the main point? He's going to do it again too. The rest of the chapter, there's a man who's a Gentile who's deaf and mute, and so Jesus is going to give him ears and a voice back, potentially symbolizing he's given ears to the Gentiles, but the Jews are deaf. But the whole point he's driving at, it is not outside that makes you unclean, it is inside. Right? In a sense, this is grade school morality, right? But it's so easy for us to fall into, right? It is so easy. And so in our context, it's not church attendance that makes you clean or unclean. You can be in church your entire life, and if God is not your God, then it accomplishes nothing, right? If you're just in church because you're an American and you're a patriot and you feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be here, and you have no love for Jesus, that accomplishes nothing, right? Likewise, we who are in church, who love Jesus, we can look out and be like, wow, you know, they've never taken communion, or they've never been baptized, or they're living in sin. God can't love them. They're unclean. We got to stay away from them. Right? If I touch them, I gotta quick wash my hands. No. It's not your clothes, it's not baptism and communion. That's not what makes you clean or unclean. Right? God is after the heart. He doesn't want bulls, he doesn't want goats, he doesn't want sacrifices. He wants a humble and willing heart. That's what he's after. All right? So let's be very careful. Let's be very careful. Make sure we don't have any traditions that are contradicting the Word of God. All right? That's a huge start. Let's make sure we're not judging based on outside, but we're looking at the heart. And let's make sure our hearts are clean. Right? The whole law is summed up in one thing: love one another. So let's love one another. Okay? Let's have a clean heart that loves God and loves neighbor. It's not the outside, it's the inside. Would you pray with me? Jesus, as we dig into your word, it is often very confusing. And so I pray for clarity. I pray that we would be able to get 2,000-3,000 years back and see you for who you are. Through the fog, that we might just get a glimpse of you, that you would reveal yourself to us. And God, I pray that if we have traditions or customs or habits or mannerisms or whatever as individuals, as a community, that you would be gracious enough to reveal them to us. That in your grace you would discipline us, that in your grace you would call us out on our sin, that we might turn from it and chase after you. And so, God, I beg you, please show us our blind spots. Reveal to us what we are doing that is not in accord with your will. And please make our hearts clean. May we focus on the inside rather than on the outside. May we get past superficial external appearances and look at the heart. And may we have clean hearts before you. I love you, Jesus, and I trust in you with everything I've got. In your beautiful name I pray. Amen.